Good evening from Texas, and good morning to the rest of the world, or good day to the rest of the world. Welcome to this edition of the Eric Miscoll Show. I'm Eric Miscoll with EMS Now. Our topic of discussion today is that scourge that has plagued the electronics manufacturing industry for quite some time now, which is the challenge of counterfeit components. We've invited two guests who have been on our shows before, who both bring kind of a unique perspective. Both of their companies are involved in mitigating the challenges associated with counterfeit components. And so let me briefly introduce, and I'll have them introduce themselves a little more openly. Oren Manor in the bottom left is the Director of Business Development at Mentor Graphics. He's joining us today from Israel. And Mark Rinehart is the founder and managing director at Whitehorse Laboratories. He joins us today from Shenzhen, China. And as always, joining us from Melbourne is the lovely and attractive Philip Stoten with Scoop. So,
thank you, Eric.
Sorry, Philip always gets the better introduction, sorry. But listen, gentlemen, thank you all for joining in here. I appreciate the time. Let's just start, as we always do, and asking you each to kind of briefly introduce yourselves and your company for the benefit of the audience. Mark, why don't we go with you to begin?
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Again, appreciate your staying up so late, and Oren, you're getting up so early in the morning. It's a very unique time zone this time. As you mentioned, my name's Mark Rinehart. I founded Whitehorse Labs here in 2004, at the time specifically to address the proliferation of counterfeits that was entering the market. We located here as trying to stop the problem as close to the source as possible, and this is certainly then was kind of the focal point of where a lot of this activity was at least originating. So over the years, we've developed a little bit beyond that, obviously, but particularly in this year in particular, but in the last 2 years, this has really raised its ugly head. So thanks for the opportunity to participate today.
Absolutely. And Oren?
Yeah, so I'm Oren. So as you know, Mentor Graphics is now part of Siemens Industry Software. So I do work for Siemens Industry Software. I'm responsible for business development for electronics manufacturing portfolio. So everything around pre-production and execution on the shop floor. Of course, Siemens has done numerous acquisitions in this space. So we do have an integrated solution coming from a lot of different companies, which we've integrated. We are setting this under the Optimism execution brand, and that has been our solution. I find that, counterfeit is one of these things that, nobody likes to talk about in the industry. You ask customers, no, it's not a problem. No, we don't have this. No. So, I sense that, in many cases, even, they like to dust it under the carpet and try to make it go away. There's no easy solution for anybody. Everybody loses for it. And there seems to be a general mentality that maybe we shouldn't really talk about it that much. So,
yeah. We definitely need to talk about it, Oren. It's definitely a real and present problem. And I've spoken to some EMS companies just over recent weeks, well, a lot of EMS companies over recent weeks, and some really curious incidents. One where the components were all, or the semiconductors were all good, and the ESD bags they were in were counterfeit. I mean, how strange is that you look at the bag and you realize it's just been printed with the ESD thing on, and it's not a proper ESD bag, but for some reason they've put real components in, and maybe they just ran out of the bags and that's what they did. But yeah, that's an odd example, but there are plenty of issues out there with counterfeiting, and anybody that's putting devices onto boards and is having to shop where they perhaps wouldn't normally shop because of the supply chain challenges is duly and correctly concerned about counterfeits.
And I think, who loses at the end of the day? We, the consumers, right? Because we get a device and it just doesn't work for 9 years like it's supposed to. It stops working after like 7-8 months. And then you have to go and find the warranty and all of that. And half of us don't even do that, right? We don't ship back the device. And of course, the OEMs also, you can't go to your contract manufacturers 2 years after and say, guys, you made a defective board. You have no evidence. It's very hard to prove. So I think also, because it takes time, and a lot of times it's reliability issue. The component works, but instead of working for 5 years and instead of working at the real extreme temperatures it was supposed to, it stops, it fails. And then you've got this, right, this electronics in some 5G base station up on the mountains. You've got to get a helicopter up there to replace it. Extremely expensive. And really, there's nobody to blame. So
yeah, and you've got to trace it back.
OEMs lose here, we the consumers lose here. So yeah, it's something we definitely have to solve.
Yeah, and is it just about, and I asked this of both of you, is it just about counterfeits at the moment, or is it because we're so short of supply, people are using maybe components that are old, maybe components that haven't been stored properly, maybe components that are slightly damaged? Are you seeing some of that as well, Mark?
Oh, yeah, we're seeing a bit of everything. I think just with the current conditions, people are being forced into channels that they wouldn't be. I think on the positive side, we're seeing better mobility of excess inventories. So stocks that somebody has are actually moving back into the marketplace appropriately. So I think one benefit we've seen is that there's better visibility and mobility of it. I mean, genuine excess inventory, but we're seeing like old product that hasn't been stored properly. We're seeing, I mean, genuine counterfeits. I mean, parts that are pulls, refurbs that I wouldn't even call them refurbs. I mean, some of them they haven't even tried to clean up yet because the demand is so urgent. They just pluck them off and put them, like retape them and go. So we've seen about everything. And that's the concerning side, is the pace that people that needs to be, the delivery needs to take place, and the level of testing that's required to detect, again, what you're mentioning, some of the, Oren, you were talking about the reliability issues. Yeah. We can verify that it fails today and some of them pass, but we don't know if we have a mix of both pass and fail in one lot. We really need to investigate that. Sarah, what's causing that failure? Because we might have caught those that failed today, but a week from now, some of those that pass could also be failing if it's a latent defect. But the time pressure to ship earlier may prohibit that level of testing from the purchaser's perspective, that they don't have time.
Yeah, and Mark, how big a spike is it? I mean, are we seeing? We always talk about this more when there's pressure on the supply chain, but is it just constant and these things are little blips, or is it a major spike?
This is a major spike. From March of this year, we have seen probably 4 times the volume of product that's being sourced from these channels. I mean, by these channels and channels without direct traceability, at least 4 times what the normal would be. The level of substandard, and I'll include substandard is like poorly packaged all the way through counterfeit devices, that is spiking. And it's coming in different waves of different product types. It was MCUs earlier in the year, and then it's been into power, like the discrete devices and powers, and now we're seeing it more in the filters. And regulators are pretty hot right now, so they kind of come in waves as well.
So I mean, I'm as I hear you talk, I'm reminded of the adage that offense always stays a little ahead of defense, right? That the in some ways the people who are doing this on the others are probably, are always going to be a little bit ahead. I guess what I'd like to focus on, though, is, and I know that you both kind of represent some different solutions here in how to address this, because there are a variety of solutions for addressing the issue. So and why don't we start there? Why don't we talk? I mean, yours is, Mark, so for you, it's the testing, but you also you do more than just testing these days, right? So.
Yeah, we do the product testing. A test profile includes inspection and electrical test methods. It's a combination of everything from visual inspection to X-ray and material analysis, up through electrical and even temperature range testing. So it's a variety and a combination of those. What's the right mix depends on what type of product we're looking at. So where the risk is truly lying. So if it's like a difference between an industrial and a commercial grade, for example. That's where the risk lies, as a commercial being sold as an industrial grade part. So it's putting the right mix in, and also putting some logic into what do we need to be targeting to identify what we think would probably be happening in terms of where a counterfeit would be originating.
So when you engage, for example, with an EMS, are they sending you some of every batch they get in? Are they sending you everything that comes in from the gray market or particular sources? How do they decide what needs to go through this process?
they should be going through a risk and assessment. We don't necessarily get involved in that entire process, although we would like to contribute, and we do contribute to, all right, you know, where you're sourcing. If you don't have traceability, it should go through some level. If they say the supplier has already had it tested, fantastic. We do recommend that you get a copy of the report that they said they've done. Get that validated to make sure it's correct, because we've seen falsified reports circulate in the marketplace. But there is some kind of risk assessment in terms of where is the source coming from, and has testing been done, and you know, therefore what level of testing would be required. So yeah, we would generally recommend, if they're a good profile would be to have the product come directly to us, or whoever is doing the testing, whether it's supplier or anybody else doing that. We do recommend seeing the entire lot. So when samples are taken for testing, it's known that those are representative of the entire lot, rather than like a few good ones that were sent to get through testing and then ship the balance. And then get those directly. Don't return them to the supplier, because that opens, you lose chain of custody, and you don't know if what's being shipped is the product that was tested. So there's certainly a protocol in place that we recommend for maintaining chain of custody and getting people into the right test plan and what needs to be tested.
And Oren, a different approach.
So we have a slightly different approach. So with the Cyborg solution, we're actually taking an image of the component and using AI algorithms on the cloud to try to predict whether it's authentic or not. One thing that I would add that we do is homogeneity testing. So in many cases, we get a reel. It was supposed to come from Murata, but it's actually 50% Murata and 50% Samsung. Now they're all the same. It's the same fit, function, and form, but it's not the same manufacturer. It's the same capacitor, same electronics. But as you said before, now if some of them fail, you're going to basically recall the whole reel, but 50% of those components are coming from the same manufacturer. And also you didn't really buy them. So we see a lot of these issues. We also see sometimes, you know, different lots. They're coming from the same manufacturer, but they weren't manufactured on the same date. Some of them are maybe, you know, a month old, some of them are new. And again, your traceability and your whole recall system is going to be impacted this because they're not really, coming from the same batch from manufacturing. Now we can do two things. We can take an image, use a reel-to-reel machine and take images pre-production. That is good, I think, like Mark said, when you have a high-risk component, you're doing spot purchases, you're buying it from somebody who has surplus, you have no clue how it was kept, what was going, you don't want to just put it into the warehouse. So you can do that, but it does require time, not a lot of cost, but time to go through those whole reels, take images of each reel. The other possibility is on the inspection, taking the images used by the pick and place camera, which is available on, I would say, 80–90% of the machines. Not all machines use vision alignment. If they use laser alignment, that's not possible. But as long as they're using visual alignment, the image is good enough to use that and then predict whether the component is authentic or not. And if it's not, basically stop the production, put the whole reel on some, suspicion, and you can definitely not ship those boards. Might have gone through the line. It does take a couple of milliseconds, but you can definitely, it's probably pre-reflow, so you can remove some of the components and you can, go and do that. And as the library is getting bigger and bigger, since it's on the cloud, we are comparing these components to a lot of other very similar components. So the advantage here is that it's becoming a very, very large set of components, which allows us to, rather probably accurately try to say whether the component, and find things like Mark said. It could be, it's a fine component, it's authentic, it's just probably 3 years old. It has some solderability issues. You might get away from soldering it, but you've got to, make sure. And at least now and you can go back to your supplier and say, guys, you sold me these new components. These are not new components. Which in the past, maybe one said, I'll say also, I mean, we've seen that the reels in many cases, there's 100 authentic, then there's one counterfeit, 50 authentic, 2 counterfeit. So they are spreading them very nicely on the reel. So it's not that easy. If you try to pick a couple from a reel and test them, it's not always easy to find them. They are becoming very, very,
sophisticated.
Sophisticated in how they do that and how they put these components, and how it's not just the reel is 100%, counterfeit, and it's all very clear. So it is becoming harder and harder.
Yeah. So if I look at those kind of strategies in a kind of a holistic approach, obviously what Mark's doing is visual inspection and has some inspection element, but it also has some electrical test and some other elements in. What Cyborg are doing is very much a visual inspection, but it's an every single device inspection. So they kind of have different merits. Do you think if you were a contract manufacturer, would you be looking at some kind of hybrid solution that, you know, maybe says, okay, well, Cyborg's thrown out these reels, we should send those to Mark and find out what's going on with those? Or are we able to ascertain where the most effort in terms of inspection is needed by having a solution that perhaps brings those things together? What do you think, Mark?
I think you're talking about and Oren as well, talking about a fascinating point in terms of strengthening. Basically, you're talking about strengthening an IPQC incoming quality control at the manufacturer level, to be able to differentiate or identify high risk. Let's just not just say counterfeit, just high risk devices. Even if they're old, you've got a potential for solderability issues, like you mentioned. So increasing the intelligence and effectiveness of incoming quality control, no matter where they do it. Some of them have logistics partners that distribute product to the right location, but being able to give them a mechanism where they can identify where the risk identify where the risk lies and be able to filter that product out. Say, all right, this is a high risk scenario. Before we even move this towards production, we're going to this should go through analysis, if not outright return for risk assessment. I think you're talking about a fascinating option as we look at the tools that are available, starting to become available with machine learning and obviously enhanced vision systems like Oren's working with, even AI to a degree of being able to look at different images from different components and different manufacturing sites. Technologies now, I think, are giving us the weapons, so to speak, to get much more sophisticated about what we can do what all of us can do to identify these products.
Yeah.
I would say, one challenge that you have is that, everything could be authentic, and then one capacitor, which is probably maybe 2 cents, could be the one counterfeit, and that could be the one that actually fails the device. So I think, traditionally people have been looking at the very high end, right? Very expensive, the CPUs, the memory, but the weakest link is any component on the board. So that's one of the challenges, is you never know where that's going to do. So I think one of the advantages of the Cyborg solution is the fact that it goes and tries to look at all the board and look at all the components. It might not identify all components because some of the components might be very rare. Maybe it's never seen them, but as long as it's a big batch, what it can do is it also compares one to each other. And then it can at least tell you, look, the 100 capacitors you've placed, they're all coming from the same manufacturer. They all look exactly the same. And if it doesn't find differences, then I think it's also a good indication, that it's authentic. I would add that I think the Cyborg solution is most attractive to the OEMs. OEMs are here that, especially the ones without manufacturing, they have, if they don't purchase the components, then they're completely outside of all this thing, right? The components are being sourced by the EMS. They come to the EMS. Who knows what the EMS is checking? They get placed. Functional test passes. Great, So I do think that any type of these solutions really benefit the OEM, giving much more visibility, much more understanding of what is really going and are the components authentic. And that's where we see with the Cyborg solution, at least, much more attractiveness. Honestly, with the EMS, we see less, willingness to open that, because it's admitting that there's holes in the supply chain and that their control is not effective. Do you really want to go and tell all of your, customers, guys, I have 3% counterfeit components on my production lines? It doesn't sound very assuring. So,
Tell me, where are you seeing it though? I mean, as I hear you speaking about this, help me understand this. Is this for larger, the top EMS who are buying it just through maybe through authorized channels might be okay, but the smaller tier EMS who may be going to the spot markets are not getting as much in allocation. are introducing more risk in the process. Where do you see it coming from?
Well, first of all, I see it all around, because I see now, a lot of EMS are doing a lot of, working also with startups, working with small companies. They want to attract, so they're doing a lot of high mix, low volume. And then it's also, they also struggle with sourcing. Everybody struggles with sourcing.
I was going to say, I think they're going through the spot channels as well.
I think it's across all. We know tier ones manufacturers around here in Europe, which are also struggling, having to go get the components from other brokers, from other sites, and not all coming from, very, very controlled mechanism. And we've also seen counterfeit components coming from the, most official flows that you can imagine. So I don't think it's only, it's definitely there. If you have a very old industrial product, which is maybe 8 years old, and you have to make another batch now, finding those components is probably a nightmare. And then you're definitely, very, very high risk. But also if it's something extremely new and just, the components can be sourced. Nobody wants to do an ECO, right? And change the components and do a respin and a revision and start the whole thing from scratch just because you can't source one of these discrete components. And then you end up buying it from wherever you can find them.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly happening. When I speak to EMS companies, particularly what Oren says, when they're working with startups or companies that are relatively small volumes, they're like, just get us the components. We need to ship product. We'll take that punt. And I hear that more and more, and EMSs are getting more pressure from their OEM customers, particularly the smaller ones, to do that. And it's not just the small EMSs that are struggling in the supply chain. It's just as difficult on a bigger scale for the big ones.
Yeah, Mark, what do you say? You were nodding your head there as Oren was speaking.
Oh, I was kind of nodding emphatically that this stuff can come from anywhere, and it comes from the channels that, obviously the risk is higher at different levels, but it comes from every channel. And it, like you started mentioning at the beginning, is that no one wants to talk about it. So does it exist? No. All right, we got to get over that and be honest about things. And then it is coming from about everywhere. These things will infiltrate your supply chain where people least expect it to. And when you're looking at a system or a combination of systems to strengthen IQC, the incoming quality control, because right now it's still okay, we're going to test this, but we're not going to test that. Where IQC really doesn't have that, it doesn't have preferences. It arrives and it goes through this process. And that's how it has to be done, and everything goes through it. As long as it's fast and efficient and at least majority accurate, you're going to be catching a lot of those things, even when they're coming from those channels that you wouldn't think that you need to check. So I'm kind of nodding emphatically that this is kind of an exciting time, and that we now have the tools to do more comprehensive. And again, at the manufacturing site, rather than at the pushing it into the supply side, and the receiver can control, or the resources are becoming available to allow them to do that.
Yeah. Do you see those resources kind of changing your business a bit, Mark? And are you keeping an eye on those? And are you maybe doing a bit of digital transformation internally that's going to improve the way you can provide that feedback?
We certainly are, and we've been working on that for some time. But again, the technology is becoming available to make some of these things possible that before sounded maybe a little bit unrealistic. And it sounds like this is what Oren's been working on, and this is quite exciting. There's been some discussion in the industry about sharing databases, and we're like, okay, but trying to match up photos to somebody else. How many files are you going to manually dig through to try to find that? Where we've got the opportunity now to go to leapfrog that, to make a significant leap in technology to something that's new. So we've been working on this, and the results are pretty exciting. So I'm kind of nodding my head, going, this is it's good. I think overall, in dark times, some good will come from it, and we're starting to see some of these things that OEMs are getting aware, and they're taking a little bit more control. I think they're going to be. We would hope that they're going to be open to some of the things that Oren's talking about, as well as some systems that can strengthen IQC and not kind of rely on an older, perhaps an older fashioned model where, this goes here and that goes there, and it just kind of disrupts the supply chain even further, that you're waiting for one component and could be the one that you're not waiting on is the one that's got a problem.
Yeah, the one you've got a problem already on the board, and the one you're waiting for is fine.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think one thing we also need to do is do a little bit of a left shift here, because one thing we're doing with this supply firm acquisition that we did is we do provide engineers data about the price of the component and the availability. And then you would think that components which have a lot of availability might have less counterfeit. The other thing we want to do is once we start collecting the cyber data, we want to take that data and push it to the designer. So we want to tell the designer, this component has high authenticity issues on the marketplace. Just know, we've seen, a couple of cases, this component, we've never seen any authenticity issue. And then the designers will be able, when they make the selection when procurement, purchasing decides which component to go from, a big selection, they'll choose components which are, relatively less prone for authenticity issues. And I think that's another way to maybe solve it. We might, get ourselves enemies with some of the component makers here, if we do this, because, it's going to be hard to prove this, and it's going to be statistical information. So we'll have to see how we do it. So, we do it objectively and fairly. But, that's one of the challenges today is when you're making sourcing decisions, you have no clue if this component have a lot of authenticity issues. Is it rather, no?
Yeah.
It's very hard to make that decisions when you don't have any data up front.
Yeah, I think the crowdsourced data and the concept of having all that data available to be able to process and be able to make that risk analysis is really fascinating. I worry that the counterfeiters would be able to, if they got access to that data, they'd be able to decide what the low-hanging fruit is to counterfeit. And you've got, I'm guessing they're shifting constantly. So what you think is a safe device, Mark, next month might be one that you're seeing a lot of counterfeits in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, yeah, I mean, they're paying attention to everything that's being done.
Yeah.
As soon as we can find it, as soon as they know that we're detecting this, they switch to something else. Yeah. I think we went back to the beginning, right? But looking at what's been reported relies on people reporting it. And if there's a reluctance to report it because that disclosure brings some perceived risk in terms of whether it's a perception or how you're conceived by your customers, and people aren't reporting, right? There's no data out there to look at. So again, some systems where we're automate that, or at least kind of get that, it can be done anonymously so people don't have that perception out there. And then you kind of mentioned you mentioned before, even the component manufacturers, where are they? They're supplying, but where are they in helping with the solution? They're complaining about it, but what are they doing about it?
Yeah.
Are they going to be able to or willing to participate in at this level and share some information? I completely understand the reservations about it, but if you disclose without control, then the guys that you're protecting from get access to that, and it makes it even harder. So they face a challenging decision, I think, in terms of at what level are they going to get involved and not put themselves at risk in doing so. But it's certainly a question I think that needs to be asked.
Yeah, and Mark, that's a really interesting point when I think about that. When you're doing what you're doing, whether it's in the very simplistic traditional method or it becomes more advanced and more digitally transformed, your relationships with everybody in the ecosystem become really important, don't they? So you've got to have the connections up and down the supply chain through the different channels, so you can identify those issues. And it's in the interest of component brokers, for example, to be able to provide that confidence and that validity. So what's your relationship with those different ecosystem players?
Historically and generally, with the component manufacturer, there's very little disclosure, and we understand why. Is that they can't release die information because someone's going to use that to clone the die. So they're very reluctant to share information. We understand why. So I think in general, they tend to prefer that this industry doesn't exist, which we understand that as well, but it does. But they kind of do the ostrich on it, or see no evil. Take your pick of which metaphor you want to use, but they kind of ignore this issue. They don't get involved. And just say, if you didn't get it from our authorized channel, we're not involved. It's safe, but if you're their consumer as well, saying, but you can't help me today. So how can you help me? You can't deliver me products. So what am I supposed to do now? And if you can't help me in verifying what I can get, then
what you see,
not a particularly good partner. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for nothing.
Yeah. So Oren, from your point of view, you operate in all different areas of the supply chain with different parts of your software offering. How important is it to get everybody to just hold their hand up and say, yeah, there's an issue here. Let's all kind of talk about it openly and kind of have a holistic solution across the supply chain?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important. Probably the only way to really solve this issue. I would hope that, some of the Mil-Aero OEMs would kind of lead this, right? And kind of mandate a solution like Cyborg, maybe like Mark's solution, and say, guys, we need this data and we want to see this data and we even want to publish this data. So we will publish that, in this, in-flight controller or some type of, avionics device, we have done a scan and we know that all components are authentic. I mean, we don't care which components are on the PCB, but it would be nice to say that they would say that they have looked at this and everything has been verified to be 100% authentic. And that might lead for, a change and start to drip into some less regulated industries, like industrial controllers or, consumer entertainment, because it's true, okay, if my phone stops working after 2 years, okay, it's not an emergency, probably nobody's going to die. It affects much more some other, but I don't see them leading this either. Everybody has this mentality that if we just buy from the big suppliers, we're fine. And we see that that's not the case, and we need to solve it. I do think that once we find cases and we show the OEM, here is cases, and we show him images, then he says, you're right. I couldn't believe it. I thought my supply chain was,
robust,
robust enough and protected. And we also see that once we find that, the contract manufacturer or the EMS also has a change, and they say, we never thought we had any counterfeit issues on our production lines, and suddenly they have a revelation and they understand that maybe it's actually good to deploy this on other products and other lines, because at the end of the day, counterfeit components causes yield issues, right? Now they are paid on 100 boards. If they have to build 120 to get 100 boards, they have to build 120, right? They, at the end of the day, suffer the cost. So if the component works and passes functional, they don't really have anything to lose. But if the component actually doesn't work and they fail functional, it's on them. And somebody says that their process isn't good, but their process is fine. So I think it is, does get into their reputation and can actually help them show that their yield is actually much, much better. And they don't have workmanship issues. It's all, components coming in. So I do think that if we start maybe showing data, maybe we have a couple of tier ones come and say, yeah, we admit we have an issue. We need to solve this. Maybe the others will come in and, if some of these, tier ones will do this, it might change. It's a little bit like COVID. I mean, this whole digitalization revolution, we've been talking about it for years. In many places, it didn't happen until COVID hit. And, suddenly we got calls from customers saying, we've got to program machines remotely. We've got to look at the lines. We can't have everybody running against the machines. Maybe now the same thing will happen on the supply chain because of the fact that we're having such a big issue and shortage. And it doesn't look like this is going to go away in the next 6 months, right? I also see the cost of the material just going up and up. So, right, I mean, this shortage is going to go on for at least another 18, 24 months. Maybe this is going to be the turning point.
The catalyst. That accelerates that change.
Let me ask, because, I want to talk about kind of, counterfeiting. I guess some of it is opportunistic and some of it is probably just blatantly criminal, right? So, and and I'm wondering how you see that relating to the shift in manufacturing that's been going on globally, right? Where there, a lot is associated with China because that's where most everything
the manufacturing
made, right? That's where the manufacturing is made. But as it's starting to migrate, closer, as people wanting, more safer supply chains, things closer, more regionalization. Are you seeing the same problems coming out in other regions, or is it still because of the bulk of the work being done in China still, most of it's coming from there. Mark, what do you think?
China is going to be at the center of it statistically because, as you mentioned, is because of the manufacturing volume here. Is it disproportionate statistically by the volume? I don't know. Unfortunately, we don't have the data on that. We certainly see it coming from sources outside of China. And I mean, you can look at the reports that are published in the industry. The people that are profiting off of that certainly are not restricted to being in China. They are everywhere, and they are the ones that are participating, whether they're the ones doing the counterfeiting or pushing it to make a profit. They're equally culpable. But yeah, I think we see that kind of on a different base. I know here in China, the ability to import e-waste, which is a huge source of counterfeit or at least fraudulent components being, new old parts being sold as new. The ability to import that e-waste has been severely controlled for many, many years here. So you can't get that stuff here as much. Now, there's a lot more being consumed here as well. So there's a domestic source of supply for that stuff that's been growing as consumer spending has grown here. But where the refurbishing is being done is not limited to China anymore. I think it's probably being pushed other places because it's hard to get that stuff here. So yeah, I think it's a global. So the source of this stuff is global now.
I also think it's completely global. Yeah, I agree with you, Mark. We've seen counterfeit in Israel. We have seen this in Hungary. We have seen this in Mexico. We have seen this in Thailand. So I don't think it's probably very big in China because, as we said, a lot of boards are being assembled in China. That's where the mass production is being made, and that's where you also need to source millions of components. If you need to find 100 components for a small batch you're doing maybe in Texas, that's doable. You need 10 million components. That becomes much, much more, challenging. But we've seen this globally. It's everywhere. And we've seen it also in a lot of low volume, high mix. Low volume, high mix, high complexity, which are still manufactured in Europe and the US. Let's say communication boards, 5G base station communications, where they found counterfeit components, in Eastern Europe and the Nordics. We found this. So I think it's everywhere. And I think many of these components are it's opportunistic, and they're actually assembled in Southeast Asia, maybe Malaysia, Thailand, Japan. That's where maybe some of these components are coming. Another thing that we've seen in COVID is that production has moved between sites. So, customers who were manufacturing in other regions decided to move production to other places. And that was disruptive also on the supply chain, because if the product was designed and you've been making it, let's say in Japan for the last couple of years, well, you have a good supply network in Japan, you suddenly move the production to Mexico, you're going to find a lot of supply chain issues because some of these components are not that available. And that's what we've also seen. I think we're also getting this now is production has shifted because of the global pandemic. People have moved production because of lockdowns, inability to travel, lose of face. When they had an NPI in the past, they just put people on planes and went there. Well, now that's not possible. Yeah. And now suddenly also people have to source these components, and it's not that easy. Not every component of it, many components which you buy in China are very hard to get outside of China. And that's probably also, easy money for some of these counterfeit makers to leverage that. So that's probably another thing that we've seen. And that's why, some of these OEMs need to be extra careful and use Mark solution, Cyborg solution, and do better, sourcing in the engineering phase in order to, make sure they don't get any bad components into their devices.
Yeah. Hey guys, I'm constantly hearing about shortages. I constantly hear about the problem of counterfeiting and instances of counterfeiting. I don't see much in the news about people going to prison or people being fined or companies being brought to book for counterfeiting components. Why is that? Is there no policing? Do we have no teeth to prosecute if we find counterfeits?
There certainly is in the U.S. There's several acts been passed, and there are people in prison for whether producing or proliferating them. And sometimes they're importing product that shouldn't be imported without licenses. So some of it are compliance issues, some of our counterfeiting issues. The U.S. certainly has teeth to do that. and they're willing to enforce it, and they should. Here, not so much. It's more of a transaction. Okay, well, get your money back if you're caught. But is there any legal pursuit? No, I don't really see much other than like the value. I was robbed of this amount, so you need to compensate. So it's a compensation, but I don't see much criminal activity. Correct. I don't see much of it. I'm not involved at that level. But no, I don't think there's a lot of teeth going on. Again, it's a matter of, as we've started with, the matter of reporting.
Yeah.
How are you going to prosecute it if nobody tells anybody about it?
Yeah, and you need to have the traceability, or you need to go through expert witnesses, or there's it's a complex process, which kind of, makes it a little bit too easy for the counterfeiters, doesn't it? If you counterfeit, several $1 million worth of components, and all you're at risk for is the ones that are found, then it's a compelling business model, isn't it? It's a criminal business model, but there does need to be enforcement, and there does need to be some cases there where people can see there's a downside to doing it.
Yeah, and there certainly are some cases. They might need to be republished as a reminder.
Yeah, I think that would be a good thing.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I actually, prior to the show, it's late at night here, so I was surfing the web, and I thought I'd look into it. And the most recent story I found was actually from 2019, and it was in LA, and it was bogus batteries being sold by a Chinese national to some companies, kind of for things. So that was other ones going back 17, 15, but nothing, since
nothing this year. Yeah.
So, anyway.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything actually either this year.
Yeah. Well, I did the same, Eric. I Googled this, and I was actually searching for something on EMS Now, and I was looking for stuff about counterfeit and supply chain. And I found an interview I did with someone on this topic in 2014. So we have been talking about this for a long, long time, and it is as big a problem, or a bigger problem, than it ever was.
So what are you
Absolutely.
saying? But that's one of the realities, what I said at the beginning, offense always staying ahead of defense, right? I mean, there's criminals are criminals, and they're going to look for the opportunity, and they will take advantage, right? And I guess, if we don't have that reported and identified or raised to a certain level, and if we don't have punishments being meted out to these people, it'll just maintain as an industry problem. But having said that, one of the issues that you gentlemen have been talking about is how the tools are getting better. Right? What we're able to do now is getting so much better than it was, in 2014 when Phil did an interview on this, right?
Yeah.
So how would you gauge that? I mean, you both seemed optimistic about that, but if you were to advise EMS companies, manufacturers out there about how they should prepare for handling this issue on a move forward basis, what would your advice be to these companies?
Training. I got to start with training the buyers. Guys, where are you going to have risk? And they need to know they need policies in place, but the buyers need to know, they need to know where to buy. And if they're not buying from those channels, what do they need to do? And not just at the purchase level, at IQC, are they looking for the right things and everything else? The awareness has to be there. I think in the distribution side, the awareness is there, but I don't think it's really there at the manufacturer's level. I don't think the guys that are placing the components on the boards are aware of this as much as they need to be aware of it.
And where would they get that training, Mark?
There's a lot of industry resources out there. They certainly have, all of them pretty much have counterfeit awareness policies, but I don't know how much of it gets down to the purchaser level. At least when they're making cognitive decisions on a day-to-day basis, is that a factor that goes into the decision-making process? That I'm not so sure about.
And have
but
those.
There certainly are resources available.
But you got to have those policies and not have people bend from those policies when someone's breathing down their neck because they can't get enough of a particular device. Oren, I'm guessing your answer is probably data and more data.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I would suggest that these contract manufacturers run a couple of pilots. They have multiple factories. Let's gauge 10,000 components in this line. that line, let's just start looking at the problem and see, if they do some testing and look at that and don't find any counterfeit components, well, maybe, in some cases, they have a rigid supply chain. If we do find issues, then we can get some understanding. So I would say, yeah, I can understand that nobody's going to put any type of solution on all lines, all products, because of the cost, and also but in order to be able to make a decision, let's scan, let's run on a couple of lines for a couple of days here and there and get enough data and try to see where we find them counterfeit. And then based on that, what do you have to do in order to, where do we want to detect this? What are the, where do you buy outside of suppliers? What maybe we have enough time that, sits for months in warehouse and we can just scan it in advance. And things like that, because once we start looking, we usually find something.
Yeah. So optimistic or pessimistic? That would be my final question.
I think also we've got, go ahead, Mark.
Sorry.
I'm going to be optimistic. I'm pessimistic in terms of, I think the profit to be made on this market is always going to draw people in to, the wrong side. I'm optimistic, though, in terms of we've seen over the years the evolution of the awareness within the industry and the standards that have been put into place to combat it. I think as the technologies become available, the resources that we have to get coverage on this issue at a much broader level than this specific spot buy or that spot buy. I think these resources are coming a lot, as Oren's working on as well. These things are available or coming available that we can deploy solutions at a much broader scale with smarter solutions than have existed historically. So I'm optimistic.
Oren, optimist or pessimist?
Yeah, I think I'm also optimistic. I think, we also need to convince the component makers to jump in here and also understand. And if we could have some data to show the component makers that one is, a lot more prone to counterfeit than another, that might make them, improve what they need to do inside their, their foundries, their manufacturing flow in order to make sure that there's less counterfeit being sent. And if we can get the OEMs, the contract manufacturers, the chip makers, and the distributors, all of these players, to play ball together, and there is a chance that we can kind of, at least reduce this to something negligible, and not like today where, it could be 4 or 5% of, the components out there, which is a lot.
As I'm listening to the conversation, I'm thinking of hackers and how we all, hackers on the internet, they annoy the hell out of us, but they also serve a purpose because they point out weaknesses. And then as a result, people come in and they strengthen the internet and the security gets better. And it's almost like counterfeiters, as I'm hearing the discussion, counterfeiters are doing that. But in response to that, the industry is now getting better on their side, getting better tools, developing the processes. Mark's talking about the necessary of training for IQC and what have you. So, maybe the counterfeiters are in some ways serving a purpose.
Making us better.
But,
that's really optimistic.
That's right. Well, Mark, I don't know.
That's what happens late at night after a few tequilas and some surfing.
No tequila. Well, in a previous job, I once worked in the criminal justice system and dealt with a lot of criminals. And the one thing I always noted about them is they have a lot of time just to kind of figure out, where they're going to strike, and they, for the full-time thing. And there's opportunity in this, and there's money in it, or they wouldn't be after it, right? So,
yeah, they don't get paid on an hourly rate, do they, Eric?
No. And so I'm optimistic on it too, in answer to Phil's question.
Good stuff.
Gentlemen, we could keep going, but I'm going to go to bed here shortly. Usually it's Phil who says that, right?
It is usually.
So I'm appreciative, but I want to thank you, and for taking the time, sharing your thoughts and your expertise. I would encourage anybody watching this who's interested in what these gentlemen have to offer, please reach out to them. You can get a hold of both of them. They're quite active on LinkedIn. If you can't get a hold of them, get a hold of me, and I'll help put you in touch with them. But thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Thank you for your insights, and hopefully we can talk about this again at some point.
Yeah, keep doing what you're doing, guys.
Yeah, Absolutely.
Thank you.
You as well, actually. People reading about it helps. So thank you.
There you go. Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Bye for now.
John.
Cheers, guys.